In the final days of April 1945, while Soviet artillery pounded the gardens above the Reich Chancellery and the scent of burning rubble drifted down the concrete stairways into Hitler's subterranean shelter, Germany's highest-ranking military leaders finally did something they had avoided for 12 disastrous years. They revealed the plain truth to their Führer. The once mighty army that had stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Volga River had now been reduced to a shrinking circle only about 10 miles wide surrounding central Berlin. The Luftwaffe survived mostly as a name on paper. The armored divisions that Hitler dragged across his map table like chess pieces had been destroyed weeks before. And the man who had driven millions to their deaths in pursuit of absolute victory now confronted a decision his generals had long been forbidden to even consider: surrender the capital or attempt to flee. For arguably the first time since 1933, senior officers dressed in field gray stood before Hitler and spoke words that would have brought removal from command, disgrace, or worse only months earlier: if you remain in Berlin, you will die here. This is the account of those final, surreal exchanges in a reinforced concrete bunker 50 feet beneath a burning city, moments when the masterminds of the Third Reich's war strategy urged their supreme leader to do the very thing he had always labeled treachery: escape. The path to this moment began not in April but through the brutal months leading up to it, months that witnessed the systematic annihilation of every defensive line between the Oder River and Berlin itself. By the middle of April 1945, Army Group Vistula, commanded by General Gotthard Heinrichsai, held a fragile chain of fortifications along the Seelow Heights, the final natural obstacle shielding the capital from the east. Heinrichsai was a master of defensive warfare, a precise and disciplined commander who had earned admiration for pulling German units out of hopeless situations on the Eastern Front. He understood completely that his task was impossible. Opposing him across the Oder River stood Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front, together fielding more than 2 million Soviet soldiers, backed by over 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery guns. Heinrichsai, on the other hand, commanded perhaps 100,000 worn-out troops, many of whom were rear area staff, police battalions, and teenage recruits. Boys from the Hitler Youth were thrown into the fight, handed rifles they scarcely knew how to operate. The German forces possessed no fuel reserves, no protection from the air, and no meaningful defensive depth. What they did have was the grim understanding that behind them stood Berlin, and beyond Berlin waited only absolute, unconditional defeat. The Soviet offensive began before sunrise on April 16. Zhukov employed a method both ingenious and horrifying. He directed 143 searchlights toward the German lines, saturating the night in blinding white glare that stunned the defenders and allowed Soviet infantry to advance with clear visibility. The result looked like the end of the world. Out of the sudden false daylight surged wave after wave of T-34 tanks and rifle units, backed by a rolling storm of fire from thousands of artillery guns that transformed the Seelow Heights into a wasteland of shattered earth and pulverized concrete. Heinrichsai's men fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew that every minute they held their ground provided another minute for civilians to escape westward toward Allied forces, away from the Soviet advance and the inevitable vengeance coming with it. They managed to hold for 3 days. German anti-tank crews destroyed scores of Soviet armored vehicles in brutal close-quarters battles among the wreckage. Teenagers armed with Panzerfausts waited in cellars and makeshift foxholes, holding their fire until T-34s came within roughly 30 meters before launching the single-shot weapons that often represented their only means of survival. But bravery cannot replace reinforcements. By April 19, the Seelow Heights were lost. Zhukov's forces surged through the breach, speeding west with the explicit order to surround Berlin before American troops could reach it from the other side. Inside the Führer bunker, a reinforced 2-level bomb shelter buried beneath the former Reich Chancellery garden, the atmosphere during that third week of April swung wildly between frantic hope and suffocating hopelessness. The upper floor held the kitchen, guard stations, and storage rooms. The lower floor contained Hitler's private rooms, a cramped conference area, and a narrow corridor lined with small offices. Sleeping quarters for key personnel lined the corridor, separated from the upper level by 18 concrete steps. The entire shelter reeked of diesel exhaust from the ventilation generator, dampness from poor drainage, and the accumulated sweat and anxiety of those trapped inside. Officers arriving from the collapsing front would descend those 18 steps and enter a world where the war continued to be won only on maps. Phantom divisions were issued orders to relieve formations that had already been wiped out, while Hitler's trembling hand shifted colored markers across charts that no longer reflected the real battlefield. On April 20, Hitler's 56th birthday, high-ranking officials gathered in the bunker for what many suspected would be the final time. Among those present were Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, Armaments Minister Albert Speer, and the two officers who would soon face the most perilous conversation of their careers, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, head of the Armed Forces Operations Staff, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces. The birthday meeting was somber. Göring, already positioning himself as Hitler's successor, proposed that the Führer withdraw to the Berghof in Bavaria, where an emergency government could be formed. Himmler, who was secretly attempting to negotiate with the Western Allies through intermediaries, supported the idea. Speer, who had recently disobeyed Hitler's scorched earth orders to destroy Germany's infrastructure, remained silent but observed everything closely. Hitler refused to commit. He rambled about non-existent counterattacks, imagining General Walther Wenck's 12th Army surging north from the Harz Mountains to break the Soviet ring around Berlin. He spoke of miracles and final triumphs that existed only in his mind. When Göring left for Bavaria and Himmler returned to his headquarters in northern Germany, both men understood they were abandoning a sinking regime. What none of them realized was that within days, Jodl and Keitel would have to confront Hitler with something far more dangerous than battlefield updates. They would have to tell him that the war was lost, and the only decision remaining concerned his own fate. But before that final confrontation could take place, the military situation needed to collapse past any room for self-deception. By April 21, Soviet artillery units positioned in Berlin's eastern districts began bombarding the city center. Artillery shells rained down near the Brandenburg Gate. The Tiergarten, once a fashionable park where Berliners enjoyed leisurely Sunday strolls, had become a deadly battleground crisscrossed by Soviet fire. On the same day, forward reconnaissance units from Zhukov's forces reached Viersen in the northeast and Königs in the southeast, tightening the noose around the city's perimeter. Meanwhile, Konev's tanks advanced westward and then turned north, threatening to link with Zhukov's forces and encircle Berlin within an impenetrable steel ring. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler demanded updates every few hours. Staff officers brought maps showing red arrows converging from multiple directions. In response, Hitler ordered units that no longer existed into action. He directed the Ninth Army, already shattered and retreating in disorder, to pivot and strike at Zhukov's flank. He also commanded SS General Felix Steiner's depleted formation, which on paper numbered multiple divisions but in reality consisted of only a few thousand exhausted soldiers, with no tanks and minimal ammunition, to launch a massive counteroffensive from the north. Steiner read the orders in disbelief and did not move. There was nothing to mount an attack with. April 22 shattered Hitler's final illusions and sparked the first serious discussions about escape. That afternoon, during the regular military briefing, it became clear that Steiner's attack had not occurred, that the Ninth Army was trapped and dying, and that Soviet forces would complete the encirclement of Berlin within days, if not hours. Hitler's reaction was explosive. Witnesses described him shouting that he had been betrayed by cowards, that the SS had failed him, that his generals had lied, and that the troops had deserted. He declared the war lost and announced that he would remain in Berlin to personally oversee the city's final defense, then die amid the ruins. For many staff members, it was the first time Hitler had openly admitted defeat. The outburst lasted roughly 20 minutes. When it ended, the bunker fell into silence, broken only by the hum of the generators and the distant thud of artillery. Jodl and Keitel withdrew to confer privately. They realized that Hitler's choice to stay and die was not merely personal, it would trap hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians inside Berlin, forcing them to fight a futile battle that would end in massive death or capture by the Soviets. What happened next is partially obscured by conflicting post-war testimonies, but the sequence of events shows the desperate and inevitable collapse of the German defense. The essential points were now clear. Either later that same day or in the early hours of April 23, Keitel and Jodl returned to Hitler with a proposal they had never imagined presenting. The Führer should leave Berlin, not surrender, not capitulate, but move to a defensible location where he could continue directing the war or, at the very least, survive long enough to negotiate terms. The most realistic destination was the Bavarian Alps, where German forces still held control of the mountainous terrain, and where the so-called National Redoubt, a rumored network of fortifications and supply depots, supposedly offered a final stronghold. In reality, the redoubt was largely a myth, a product of Goebbels' propaganda apparatus, further amplified by Allied intelligence, which overestimated German preparations. Yet in the desperate atmosphere of late April, myths carried immense influence. Keitel presented the case methodically. Berlin was indefensible. Soviet encirclement was imminent. The Ninth Army could not break through to relieve the capital. Wenck's 12th Army was too far south and too weak to make a difference. Remaining in the bunker meant almost certain death or capture. Hitler listened without interruption. His hands, trembling from Parkinson's disease, stress, or a combination of both, rested on the map table. According to one staff officer, his eyes seemed to focus somewhere beyond the concrete walls of the bunker. The plan was framed not as a retreat, but as a strategic redeployment. Keitel proposed that Hitler fly south to the Berchtesgaden area immediately, leaving a trusted deputy, perhaps Goebbels, to manage the defense of Berlin. From Bavaria, the Führer could coordinate the southern armies, maintain contact with whatever governmental structures remained functional, and preserve the symbolic leadership of the Reich. Jodl supported the plan with operational specifics. Aircraft were still available at Gatow Airfield in western Berlin, although the Luftwaffe controlled only limited airspace. Alternatively, a ground convoy could attempt to break out to the southwest before the encirclement was complete. Wenck's army, if redirected, might create a corridor for escape. But the window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The opportunity was closing quickly, yet it had not fully disappeared. Hitler still had a chance to escape. The room waited in tense silence for his decision. Outside, the bunker's ventilation system circulated stale air through filters meant to guard against gas attacks. Above ground, Soviet rockets struck the Reich Chancellery, collapsing walls and igniting fires that cast flickering orange light across the ruined city. Hitler's response did not come in a single statement, but unfolded over several hours of brooding reflection, interspersed with monologues that obsessively returned to themes of betrayal, destiny, and historical legacy. "I built the Nazi movement from nothing," he reminded those present. He had defied the Treaty of Versailles, reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, dismembered Czechoslovakia, and launched the largest military campaigns since Napoleon. If he fled now, he would be remembered not as the conqueror who expanded Germany's borders to unprecedented heights, but as the coward who ran when the Reich needed him most. Hitler insisted that his presence in Berlin gave meaning to the deaths of his soldiers. If he abandoned the capital, morale would collapse, and the defense would disintegrate into a panicked rout. He also entertained the fantasy that his presence might somehow inspire a final miraculous turnaround, that his will alone could conjure the victory that his shattered armies had failed to achieve. This was pure magical thinking, completely detached from any military reality, but Hitler had long since crossed the line where fact and fantasy became indistinguishable. Keitel tried again. He stressed the potential of the 12th Army, the possibility of linking up with remaining southern forces, and the importance of preserving the command structure. Jodl, more cautious, focused on operational necessities. If the Führer insisted on staying, at least allow the High Command to relocate so that coordination of military operations could continue. Hitler dismissed both arguments. He would stay in Berlin. The generals could leave if they chose. This was the turning point, the moment when the German High Command faced a decision that would shape the final chapter of the European war. Keitel and Jodl could have defied Hitler, could have forced an evacuation, or simply departed and left him behind. Yet neither man had the willpower or ruthlessness to break with the leader they had served for years. Instead, they reluctantly accepted his decision. Keitel set out for the 12th Army headquarters to personally urge Wenck toward Berlin, while Jodl moved north to maintain communications and coordinate what remained of the German military effort outside the city. Both men understood they were participating in a charade. Wenck's army lacked the strength to relieve Berlin, and coordinating military operations was meaningless when there were no effective units left to command. Yet the pretense allowed them to leave the bunker while preserving the appearance of obedience. On April 23, they departed, boarding staff cars that sped through rubble-strewn streets toward the rapidly shrinking perimeter still under German control. Inside the bunker, Hitler turned his focus to other concerns: Eva Braun's choice to stay with him, the mechanics of his eventual suicide, and the drafting of a political testament that would assign blame for Germany's destruction to everyone except himself. Above ground, in the districts surrounding the city center, the war discussed in abstract terms within the bunker unfolded with brutal immediacy. Teenage boys from the Hitler Youth and elderly men from the Volkssturm crouched behind improvised barricades built from overturned trams, rubble, and furniture salvaged from shattered apartments. Many had only days of training. Their weapons ranged from obsolete rifles to Panzerfaust anti-tank launchers, which required them to approach enemy armor at suicidal proximity. They wore armbands instead of uniforms, marking them as irregular combatants who could expect no mercy if captured. Soviet urban warfare tactics were harsh but effective: suppress buildings with artillery and tank fire, advance infantry under covering fire, clear each structure room by room using grenades and submachine guns, and then repeat. German defenders inflicted casualties, but Soviet losses in the Battle of Berlin would ultimately exceed 300,000 killed and wounded. Still, the outcome could not be changed. Every block captured by the Red Army was lost to the Germans forever. There were no reserves, no reinforcements, and no fallback positions. When ammunition ran out, the fighting ceased. When supplies were exhausted and Soviet forces closed in, the defenders either surrendered or were killed. Among those trapped in the chaos. Among the defenders, confusion about Hitler's intentions was widespread. Official propaganda continued to speak of imminent relief, secret weapons soon to be deployed, and the Führer's unwavering resolve to defend Berlin to the last man. Radio broadcasts urged the population to resist, promised that Wenck's army was racing to their aid, and framed the battle as a heroic stand against Bolshevik barbarism. Yet rumors spread constantly. Some claimed Hitler had already fled to Bavaria or even to South America via submarine. Others insisted he was dead and that the broadcasts were lies. A few suggested he remained in the bunker but was planning a breakout to reach the Alpine redoubt, where the final battle would supposedly take place. In this environment of fragmented information and shifting authority, individual soldiers made their own decisions. Some fought with fanatical determination, believing they were buying time for the Führer's escape or protecting their families from Soviet reprisals. Others deserted, slipping westward in civilian clothing, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British rather than the Red Army. Still others remained in cellars and ruins, paralyzed by fear and exhaustion, until Soviet infantry arrived, and the question of resistance or surrender was decided for them. Inside the bunker complex, a parallel world persisted where the hierarchies and routines of Nazi governance continued as if the world above were not in flames. Goebbels, who had moved his family into the bunker against the protests of his wife Magda, spent hours drafting propaganda communications that would never be widely disseminated. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, and a man whose influence grew as military leaders departed or fell from favor, maneuvered to stay close to the Führer, perhaps hoping for a last-minute turn of events that might preserve his own position. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, whose relationship with him had been carefully concealed, occupied herself with domestic routines, changing clothes, applying makeup, and organizing meals that stood in surreal contrast to the apocalyptic destruction above. Staff officers maintained the illusion of military briefings, updating maps with information that was hours old and discussing operations that would never take place. Secretaries typed orders that would never be delivered. Messengers carried messages across rooms separated by mere meters, preserving the formalities of rank and protocol even as the structures they represented disintegrated into irrelevance. The question of escape resurfaced intermittently over the following days, though never again as a formal proposal from the High Command. On April 25, Soviet forces from Zhukov's and Konyev's fronts linked up to the west of Berlin near. Konyev completed the encirclement, turning Berlin into an isolated island surrounded by a sea of Soviet tanks and artillery. Around 300,000 German soldiers and civilians were trapped inside, including Hitler in his bunker. On the same day, American and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River, effectively cutting Germany in half and rendering any coordinated defense impossible. The Third Reich, which at its peak had stretched from Norway to North Africa and from the Atlantic coast to the Volga, now existed only in fragmented pockets of resistance, shrinking by the hour. In this situation, the idea of Hitler flying to Bavaria became absurd. There were no flight paths safe from Soviet fighters, no airfields secure enough to guarantee takeoff, and no ground routes a convoy could traverse without being destroyed. The opportunity had vanished. The man who once held the fate of Europe in his hands was now trapped beneath a dying city in a concrete bunker. The generals who had urged him to leave had departed themselves, leaving him to face the consequences of his stubborn refusal. Yet Hitler's choice to remain, sealing his own fate, had a perverse strategic rationale rooted in symbolism and myth. He understood, perhaps more clearly than his generals, that surviving in exile would be meaningless. Captured or in hiding, he would become a curiosity, a failed dictator whose grand ambitions had dissolved into humiliating flight. But dead in Berlin, amidst the ruins of his capital, he could control the story of his own end. He could frame it as martyrdom, a heroic fall with his kingdom rather than living in disgrace. This was not rational strategy but the narcissistic logic of a man who equated his personal destiny with Germany's, seeing his death not as the collapse of a criminal regime but as the tragic conclusion of a historical epic. Thus, he remained in the bunker, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyal followers, dictating his will and testament, planning his suicide with meticulous care reminiscent of his military operations, and waiting for the moment when Soviet forces would reach the Reich Chancellery and find his body. Wenck's 12th Army, the force Keitel had tried to mobilize as a relief effort, never arrived. Wenck, a competent officer, understood the military realities far better than the fantasies circulating in the bunker. While his orders directed him northeast toward Berlin, his true priority was to keep an escape route open to the west, allowing the remnants of the 9th Army and fleeing German civilians to move to safety. toward the American lines rather than fall into Soviet captivity. On April 28, elements of Wink's force advanced to within a few miles of Potsdam, the closest they would ever reach the capital before being stopped by fierce Soviet counterattacks. Wink transmitted a radio message to the bunker, explaining that he could advance no further and recommending that any personnel wishing to escape should attempt a westward breakout toward his positions. The message was unambiguous: there would be no relief, no rescue, and no miraculous intervention. Hitler read the message but set it aside. By this point, he had completed his final preparations. Shortly after midnight on April 29, he married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony held in the bunker's map room. He dictated his political testament, a document that blamed Jews, generals, and international conspiracies for Germany's defeat while refusing to accept any personal responsibility. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor, a surprising choice to many, as Donitz commanded what little remained of the Navy but had no governmental experience. Afterward, he prepared for his suicide. On the afternoon of April 30, with Soviet forces fighting their way through the government district less than a quarter mile from the Reich Chancellery, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to his personal suite in the lower bunker. Staff members had been informed of his intentions. Goebbels, Bormann, and a few others waited in the corridor. At approximately 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot echoed through the confined space. Agents entered the suite to find Hitler's body slumped on a sofa, a gunshot wound to the right temple and a pistol on the floor. Eva Braun lay beside him, dead from cyanide poisoning. The bodies were carried up the emergency stairwell into the Chancellery garden, placed in a shallow crater created by Soviet shelling, doused with gasoline, and set alight. The cremation was incomplete, hindered by insufficient fuel and lack of time. Soviet artillery continued to shell the area, forcing those conducting the makeshift funeral to retreat back into the bunker in under an hour. They left the charred remains in the crater, covered them with dirt, and descended underground. 2 days later, Soviet troops discovered the site, recovered the bodies, and transported them to Moscow for forensic examination. Yet on that afternoon, in the garden above the bunker where Hitler had sometimes walked in better days, the man who had unleashed the most destructive war in human history ended his life not in a heroic last stand, but in a rushed, squalid improvisation amid the ruins of the capital he had condemned. The deeper irony of those final days was that the general's proposal to escape, dismissed by Hitler as cowardice, might actually have prolonged the conflict and increased suffering rather than shortened it. Had Hitler fled to Bavaria, Hitler could have become a focal point for fanatical SS units and die-hard Nazis determined to continue resisting in the Alpine regions. The myth of the national redoubt, although mostly baseless, might have motivated prolonged guerrilla warfare that would have lasted for months, causing additional casualties on all sides. In early 1945, Allied commanders were genuinely concerned about this scenario, dedicating resources to planning operations in southern Germany that ultimately proved unnecessary. Hitler's decision to stay in Berlin, therefore, had the unintended effect of concentrating the collapse of the regime. When he died and Donitz assumed control, the new leadership lacked any ideological commitment to continued suicidal resistance. Donitz prioritized surrendering to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets and formally requested peace within a week. Germany's unconditional surrender was enacted on May 8, 1945, just 8 days after Hitler's death. Had Hitler escaped, established a rump government in southern Germany, and continued issuing orders to the forces still loyal to him, the war in Europe might have stretched into the summer or beyond, producing catastrophic consequences for both military personnel and civilians trapped in extended combat zones. The conversations between Hitler and his generals during those final days also revealed the profound dysfunction at the core of Nazi Germany's command system. For 12 years, senior military officers subordinated professional judgment to ideological loyalty, executed criminal orders, and participated in a system demanding unquestioning obedience even when following those orders meant disaster. Kluge and Jodl were competent staff officers who understood logistics, operations, and strategy. Yet they had spent years enabling a dictator whose military decisions increasingly diverged from reality. When they finally told Hitler the truth, that Berlin was lost, the armies destroyed, and remaining in the capital meant certain death, they were not asserting institutional authority but making a desperate, belated effort to salvage something from the wreckage. When Hitler rejected their counsel, they accepted his decision and departed, preserving the appearance of command even as the authority of that command became meaningless. This pattern of complicity and abdication characterized the Wehrmacht's relationship with Hitler throughout the war. Officers who could have resisted his worst strategic errors instead rationalized, adapted, or silently complied. By April 1945, they had forfeited any moral or practical authority to challenge him. The consequence was a military catastrophe that consumed millions of lives and left Germany in ruins. For the soldiers and civilians trapped in Berlin during those final days. In those final days, whether Hitler remained in the bunker or had fled was largely irrelevant to the people trapped in Berlin. The immediate reality of Soviet artillery, street-to-street combat, and collapsing infrastructure dominated everyday life. Food supplies dwindled to near-starvation levels, and potable water became scarce as municipal systems failed. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Thousands of people took refuge in cellars and subway tunnels, emerging only when necessary. Above ground, the city had become a nightmarish landscape of burning buildings, unexploded ordnance, and corpses left unburied, as there was no safe way to retrieve them. The approach of the Red Army caused widespread fear of reprisals, fears that tragically proved justified. Many Soviet soldiers, driven by revenge for atrocities committed by German forces in the USSR, carried out mass violence against civilians. Women and girls endured systematic sexual assault. Arbitrary executions were common, and property was looted or destroyed. The capture of Berlin was not a clean military operation but a brutal reckoning, reflecting both the savagery of the Eastern Front and the depth of hatred the war had generated. Amid this chaos, the illusion of command persisted in fragmented forms. Local officers improvised defensive measures, sometimes showing genuine tactical skill. Hitler Youth units fought with reckless courage born of indoctrination and desperation. SS units executed suspected deserters and hanged civilians accused of defeatism, enforcing loyalty through terror even as the regime they served disintegrated into irrelevance. Radio broadcasts continued to promise relief until the transmitters were destroyed. Leaflets urged continued resistance until there was no means to print or distribute them. The machinery of Nazi governance continued, driven by institutional momentum, producing the surreal spectacle of a state that no longer existed except in the minds of those unwilling to recognize its collapse. Amid the thousands of men and boys pressed into a hopeless defense, some surely wondered what their leaders were doing. Was the Führer, whose portrait had hung in every school and public building, sharing their fate, or was he preparing his escape? Did their sacrifices serve any purpose beyond delaying the inevitable by a few hours or days? The answer arrived too late to matter. By the time news of Hitler's suicide reached the remaining garrison, Soviet forces already controlled most of the city center. The Reich, a symbol of German parliamentary democracy that the Nazis had rendered meaningless in 1933, finally fell to the Soviet assault on April 30th. After fierce fighting, Red Army soldiers raised the Soviet flag over the ruined dome, a moment that would be staged repeatedly for propaganda photographs. Resistance in other districts continued sporadically for another day or two, but without any central leadership or hope of relief, most units either surrendered or simply disbanded. On May 2, General Helmuth Weidling, the officer Hitler had appointed to command Berlin's defense, formally capitulated to the advancing Soviet forces. Around 130,000 German soldiers were taken into Soviet captivity. Civilian casualties during the battle were estimated to exceed 100,000. The city itself lay in ruins. Roughly a third of its buildings were destroyed or severely damaged, its infrastructure lay in tatters, and its population was traumatized, now facing occupation under the four-power Allied control that would divide Berlin for the next 40 years. The ultimate irony of Hitler's refusal to flee was that it changed nothing in terms of the military outcome yet changed everything symbolically. Militarily, his presence in Berlin had no impact on the result, the city would have fallen whether he stayed or fled. The war would have ended regardless of where he chose to die. Symbolically, however, his decision to remain cemented the manner in which the Nazi regime's collapse would be remembered. It removed any chance of Hitler becoming a fugitive legend, hiding in South America or a remote stronghold, issuing calls for renewed struggle and inspiring neo-Nazi movements. Instead, it concentrated the regime's end into a single, undeniable image, the Führer dead by his own hand in a bunker beneath the capital he had brought to ruin. This image conveyed a finality that no capture or escape could have provided. It represented the absolute termination of the Third Reich's political authority, leaving no ambiguity regarding the regime's defeat for the millions who had suffered under Nazi rule, for the Allied nations that had fought to destroy it, and for the German people now facing occupation and reconstruction. Hitler's death in Berlin was not a tragic martyrdom but an ignoble conclusion to a criminal enterprise that had brought devastation to the world. The conversations in the bunker during those final days encapsulated the moral and strategic collapse of Nazi Germany's leadership. Kittel's maps sprawled across the table. Jodl offered cautious operational assessments. Hitler's hands trembled as he rigidly insisted on staying. Staff officers listened, offered advice, and departed, leaving him to his fate. These were men who had commanded armies, directed operations across continents, and wielded life-and-death authority over millions. Yet for 12 years, they had subordinated professional military judgment to ideological fanaticism and personal loyalty to a dictator whose strategic decisions were disastrous. When they finally offered Hitler a path of escape, it was not an act of delayed wisdom but a desperate improvisation born of self-preservation. And when he refused, they accepted his refusal because they had trained themselves never to defy him even when disobedience might have served Germany's interests better than obedience. The outcome was the total destruction of the regime they had served, plunging Germany into the hell of occupation, division, and national disgrace that would take decades to overcome. For the teenage Volkssturm fighter digging a shallow trench amid the rubble, the old soldier barricading a shattered apartment, or the civilian struggling to survive in the ruins, Hitler's presence or absence was ultimately irrelevant. What mattered was the immediacy of the destruction around them, the relentless advance of Soviet troops, and the collapse of the world they had known. As Soviet tanks rumbled ever closer, life in the bunker continued with grim routine. Secretaries typed out orders that would never be carried out. Mothers huddled in cellars with their children as artillery shells crashed overhead. For those trapped inside, the question of whether Hitler had escaped or remained was a distraction from the urgent demands of survival. Yet, viewed through the lens of history, it mattered immensely. It mattered because his decision shaped how the war's conclusion would be interpreted, how the collapse of the Nazi regime would be recounted, and how the moral reckoning of Hitler's crimes would unfold. Had he fled, he would have remained a living problem, a political figure whose mere existence complicated peace negotiations, whose words could inspire continued resistance, and whose eventual capture or death would require careful management by the Allies. By choosing to die in Berlin, Hitler removed all of those uncertainties. He made his own end final and unavoidable, and in doing so, he inadvertently provided closure to a conflict that might otherwise have lingered unresolved for months or even years. This may have been the only decision in the final year of the war that served any purpose beyond satisfying his own narcissistic delusions of historical importance. The staff officer who observed Kittel emerge from that private meeting with Hitler, his face pale, tense, and drawn, clutching maps marked with routes that would never be taken, understood in that instant what it would take Germans years to fully comprehend. The leadership that had promised greatness had delivered annihilation. Strategies that had purported to secure victory had ensured defeat. An ideology that demanded unwavering loyalty had exacted total sacrifice for nothing. In the flickering light of the bunker's electric lamps, amidst the acrid scent of ventilated diesel and the sweat and fear of men crowded together, with the muffled thunder of Soviet artillery shaking dust from the concrete ceilings, the final act of the Third Reich unfolded, not as a tragic, epic spectacle, but as a pitiful, chaotic, and utterly avoidable collapse. It was a farce. A regime that had terrorized an entire continent was reduced to a handful of desperate men in an underground tomb, shuffling papers and moving imaginary armies across maps while the real forces above destroyed the city they had claimed to defend. 75 years later, Berlin has been rebuilt into a vibrant capital, yet the memory of those final days remains etched into the city's landscape and collective consciousness. The location of the Reich Chancellery is now an unremarkable stretch of apartment buildings and parking lots. The bunker itself was demolished, filled with rubble, and paved over, erased as thoroughly as the regime it once protected. There are no monuments, no commemorative markers, no tourist attractions celebrating Hitler's last stand, only a simple informational placard noting the site and providing historical context without glorification. This deliberate erasure reflects a broader German understanding that some places should not be preserved and that certain legacies deserve oblivion rather than memorialization. The conversations about escape that took place in the bunker, the maps marked with desperate routes to Bavaria, and the staff officers who moved between rooms carrying meaningless messages, these have been documented in testimonies and histories, analyzed by scholars, and incorporated into the broader narrative of the war's conclusion. Yet they have not been memorialized or glorified because there was nothing in those moments worth celebrating. What endures is the larger lesson, the catastrophic consequences of unchecked power, the dangers of subordinating professional judgment to ideological fanaticism, and the immense cost of complicity with criminal leadership. The generals who urged Hitler to flee were not heroes attempting to save their leader from an unfair fate. They were accomplices belatedly realizing that the enterprise they served was doomed, hoping to salvage themselves from the wreckage. Their earlier failures, to resist criminal orders, to prioritize Germany's welfare over Hitler's ambitions, directly contributed to the catastrophe they now faced. And Hitler's refusal to escape, consistent with his character and worldview, sealed both his fate and that of the regime he had built, ensuring the collapse would unfold in total, unavoidable finality. Hitler's grandiose self-image meant that his choice to stay was far less a brave decision to share the fate of his people than a narcissistic determination to control the story of his own death. Neither the general's proposal nor the Führer's refusal reflected moral clarity or strategic insight. Both were products of a system that had long since severed any connection to ethical governance or rational policymaking. Ultimately, the events of April 1945, when Germany's top generals urged Hitler to flee, do not tell a story of missed opportunities or inevitable tragedy, but of complete moral and strategic collapse reaching its logical endpoint. The war Hitler had waged to secure German dominance across Europe had instead brought Soviet armies to Berlin's very gates. The ideology he had promoted as the foundation of a thousand-year Reich had endured barely 12 years before collapsing into total defeat. The loyalty he demanded from his generals produced not victory, but catastrophe, not honor, but mass death. And his decision to remain in Berlin rather than flee, offered as a way out by officers who had spent years enabling his worst impulses, was not the defiant act he imagined, but the ultimate acknowledgement that there was nowhere left to run, no position left to defend, and no future left to claim. The Reich that had once conquered most of Europe met its death in a small concrete bunker beneath the ruins of its capital. He died in a concrete bunker beneath the ruins of the capital he had built, leaving behind millions of corpses, a shattered continent, and a legacy of such profound evil that his name would eternally stand as a symbol of how far human civilization can fall when power is severed from morality, ambition, and accountability. If this story of desperate endgames and failed attempts to escape captivates you, and if you want to uncover more untold moments from history's greatest conflict, moments where decisions made in bunkers and command posts shaped the fate of millions, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next in-depth exploration of World War II's most gripping human dramas.